Before I get to tonight's event, I just want to remind you that Thursday at 4:30, Scott Reeder is giving a gallery talk in conjunction with his show across the hall. Thursday they'll be shooting all day, and the shooting will be some part of the talk on Thursday. But as with Scott usually, we'll just find out what's happening. So the talk will be led by students from Julia Fish's Seminar 3 class. So just so you know that, it's in degree form, that they're in control. And in terms of voices lectures, we don't have our next one until the end of October. That will be Lucy McKenzie, the Scottish painter. And then we'll have 3 in November. So just put that in your mind. And we'll have our poster next week. Other events that are happening. As you know, Scott Reeder's show is part of At the Edge, and that show continues through this Saturday, and the next show will be Samakshi Singh, which opens October 8th, I believe. So, and one other little announcement, for those of you grad students that I had emailed about signing up to meet with John, all of those spots have been filled, but I will, what I want to do is meet with you guys soon. I'm sorry if you didn't get it, because my email has been a disaster. But what I want to do is meet with you guys soon about all of the things that go on between Gallery 400 and your program. So look for that email soon. Okay. Tonight, I'm very pleased to have here with us John Paul Ricco, who will be giving a lecture called Name No One Man. And for those of you who come here often, you know that I don't like to talk about the project of the speaker do that. But I would want to tell you a little bit about John. He's an assistant professor in contemporary art history, theory, and criticism at Texas Tech University, where he teaches undergraduate courses in 20th century art and graduate seminars on such topics as the history of institutional critique, site-specific art practices, art after aesthetics, and artists as writers. His theoretical work within the discipline of art history and contemporary art focuses in a variety of fields, from aesthetic and sexual ethics to architecture and gender studies. He previously taught at the School of the Art Institute here in Chicago and held a research fellowship at the University of California, Berkeley, and at Cornell University's Society for the Humanities. Last year, the University of Chicago Press published his book, The Logic of the Lure, and this book is actually for sale tonight. They're $20 each. I have only 5 copies. But you can see me after the lecture, and I found out that John will sign it for you if you like. But tonight only. And one other thing I was about to forget. A new thing in John's life is that he is now an editor at the CAA's Art Journal. This talk tonight is fairly dense. It's going to be very interesting. I have tons of slides to show you. Not really. And I hope you enjoy it. So please welcome John Paul Ricco.
I want to thank everyone for being here. It's a real honor to be invited to participate in this lecture series. It's been a pleasure working with Lorelei. And it's always good to be back in Chicago, which I've considered my home now for the last 13 years.
John, can you speak up?
Sure. The mic's not on.
Is that going to be possible?
As someone engaged in critical theory, I take my work to be a problemization, specifically a putting into question and a rethinking of visual representation, visual-based epistemologies, and visualizations of social sexual subjects. At the same time, the work that I do as a writer, in my writing, is itself problematized, such that one might locate my critical theoretical practice at the juncture of the threshold or limits of perception and the illegibility and iterability of writing, which is to say, at the inevitable disjuncture between seeing, saying, and writing, an inevitability that marks an unavoidable and ineradicable blind spot in art historical discourse that is intensified in my work by an attention to such non-evidentiary things as betrayal, loss, disappeared, imperceptible, blinks, winks, blindness, and, as my principal focus today, erasure. Whereas others have defined theory as a mode of representation, I wish to pursue a theoretical practice that, in terms of both its objects of inquiry and its method, approaches the unrepresentable without necessarily being abstract, ephemeral, or an absolute negation. As a critical queer theorist, my goal, if I may put it that way, is a social ethics thought in terms of the spatiality of erotics and writing, predicated on the persistence of the anonymous, itinerant, imperceptible, and inaudible. This, then, is just as much a matter of legibility as it is of visibility, of reading what is yet to be written and visualizing what remains unseen. My talk today involves a return to various scenes of writing, beginning with Jacques Derrida's 1966 lecture, Freud and the Scene of Writing. In it, Derrida addresses the metaphors of writing in Freud's ongoing development of theories of perception, the unconscious, and memory, which might be said to culminate in Freud's 1925 paper, A Note on the Mystic Writing Pad. The last sentence of Freud's paper imagines what seems to be an impossible, two-handed writing erasing. Here's the quote. If we imagine one hand writing upon the surface of the mystic writing pad, while another periodically raises its covering sheet from the wax slab, we shall have a concrete representation of the way in which I tried to picture the functioning of the perceptual apparatus of the mind. So you know what Freud is talking about are those wax and cellophane plastic writing tablets that many of us may be familiar with from our childhood, right? Where with a stylus you make a mark and it's there temporarily until you raise the, right, you get. Towards the end of his lecture, Derrida argues that in that paper, Freud, quote, performed for us the scene of writing, but we must think the scene in other terms than those of individual or collective psychology or even of anthropology. It must be thought in the horizon of the scene/stage of the world as the history of that scene stage, end quote. Specifically, this is at once a path-breaking scene stage for Freud and for Derrida, and thus perhaps for us, and a path that breaks through any possible scene stage, something like the obscene. For although we might surmise that the scene referred to in the title of Derrida's lecture intends to hint at the so-called primal scene, in the end, he suggests that it might also refer to other scenes of an equally prohibitive sexual nature that in part find analogy in writing. He intimates this through a quote from Freud's own Inhibitions, Symptoms, and Anxiety, that text. And here's the quote. As soon as writing, which entails making liquid flow out of a tube onto a piece of white paper, assumes the significance of copulation, or as soon as walking becomes a symbolic substitute for treading upon the body of Mother Earth, both writing and walking are stopped because they represent the performance of a forbidden sexual act. In what follows, I write on the sociality and spatiality of other scenes of writing, ones that imply neither the masturbatory nor the incestuous acts suggested by Freud, but some other equally forbidden alliance and a path breaking all their own, that I will argue is the opening onto or an exposure to the promise and potential of community. Community understood not in terms of a collective totality, psychological, anthropological, or otherwise, say even political, but as an indistinct and incalculable sharing that is, at times, also a traitorous collaboration. community only as the one to come, and incessantly so. Can we turn down the lights? I start with two divergent statements, each in response to work by Robert Rauschenberg from the first years of the 1950s. The first is that of an exasperated Barnett Newman upon seeing Rauschenberg's unpainted canvas paintings. Hump thinks it's easy. The point is to do it with paint. The second is part of the epigraph to John Cage's essay about his close friend and collaborator, addressed to an anonymous addressee and clarifying a question of chronology. To whom it may concern, the white paintings came first, my silent piece came later. J.C. Let's see. How do I, let's see. No. There should be one before this, right? Okay, good. Thanks. The white paintings referred to by Cage are a series of works that Rauschenberg executed in 1951 using nothing more than ordinary white house paint and canvas, and my silent piece, quote unquote, of course refers to Cage's perhaps most well-known and often discussed composition, 4 minutes and 33 seconds of 1952, which consists of 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. Clearly, Cage and Rauschenberg understood the potential of an artistic practice that effectively, and yet through the simplest of methods, could fundamentally alter conceptions of painting and musical composition, in which, for instance, an unpainted canvas and a specific duration of silence, which are none other than that unpainted canvas and that specific time of silence, are the persistence of existing as painting and as musical composition. In the white paintings, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, and Rauschenberg's erased de Kooning drawing, the work of art exposes and is exposed to the potential to be and to not be at once. An exposure that is what Bill Haver refers to as art's work. Art's work runs the risk that is the full force of potentiality, such that in the wake of the white paintings, it is difficult any longer to ignore the absence of image that is the condition that enables any image to be registered, just as Cage's piece performs silence as the outside that insidiously dwells within all sound and enables the latter to be heard. Erasure. Erasure turns drawing, turns a and perhaps any drawing around. It turns on drawing. It betrays drawing. Within the realm of drawing, erasing cannot be trusted or counted on. As we shall see, the incalculable is a predicament that we may not be able to nor want to overcome. The questions of calculation, of how many count, and even more so, of how one counts and of who counts, both as counter and counted, all of these, it will seem, must remain only partially answerable. For when it is a matter of drawing, does erasing still count, even if, as I have already suggested, it cannot be counted on, that is, trusted? When it comes to drawing, what can one count on? In the case of Willem de Kooning, it seems justified to say that not only did he continue in the artistic tradition of preliminary drawings, sketches, and studies, but that he was a consummate draftsman, not simply one who drew, but who masterfully exhibited the qualities of disegno, that artistic achievement enshrined by Giorgio Vasari and academically maintained for centuries. Presumably, this played some part in Rauschenberg's decision to approach this successful older artist and request one of his drawings for the purposes of erasing it. Evidently, and not too surprisingly, de Kooning initially balked at the idea, but eventually relented and decided to give the young artist as a gift not simply any drawing, but one that was thoroughly and heavily covered with pencil, crayon, charcoal, and other such media. So, let's see here you have just an example of any number of drawings that de Kooning was executing at this time. Yet, as Leo Steinberg suggests in his recent lecture on Rauschenberg, there may be another reason why he, Rauschenberg, was drawn to de Kooning. One that has less to do with de Kooning's drawing practice than it has to do with his own erasing, or more accurately, the fact that, in Steinberg's words, quote, de Kooning was the one who belabored his drawings with an eraser, end quote. It might be said that de Kooning's expert draftsmanship was predicated upon his approach or exposure to drawing's potentiality, including its potential to not be, namely, the force of erasure. The relation between drawing and erasing, then, is not oppositional as much as it is an infinite folding of the two across each other. Erasure is the undrawing, or better yet, the withdrawing of drawing with the eraser, that is, the withdrawal of drawing without necessarily being drawing's negation or annihilation. A decreation rather than a destruction, a worklessness rather than the total absence of work. As Rauschenberg has said, he wished to use the eraser as a drawing tool. Erasing as an unworking of the work of drawing puts into question what it is we mean when we speak of the work of art and of artistic practice as productive. Erasing is a process or event, a means of doing as a means of undoing, in which the actual sheet of drawing paper as work of art is the inessential residue of art's work as unworking erasure. Erasure is the vent of wanting not to, or, as Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener might say, of preferring not to draw in drawing. Yet it is a withdrawing that remains, residually and inexhaustibly, withdrawing and within drawing. Erasing is potentially infinite and defies closure or completion, such that Rauschenberg could have never erased enough. It is this inexhaustibility of erasure with which he leaves us, or gives to us, as though a gift, here at the exhaustion of drawing. In regard to the erased de Kooning drawing, it might be said that drawing is beside itself, located at that non-localizable juncture where drawing ends and erasing begins. One might also say that here, drawing is beside the point, including the point, or is it points, with which to draw. So to rephrase and reverse Newman's statement, one might say that the point is not to do it with the pointed end of the pencil. But what is the it that is being done? Newman's and Rauschenberg's, and even my own. The answer as to what is at stake here might be something like art, drawing, or perhaps something else as well, which remains imperceptible. For the moment, however, let us remain with drawing and say that the point of erasing is to do it, namely drawing, in reverse. A restating of drawing that is literally a turning back on the act of drawing, perhaps of turning one's own back on drawing, and at the same time, a turning again of or within drawing that opens up or exposes drawing to its potential return or its potential abandonment. Erasure, then, is a drawing over that inversely draws over drawing and returns drawing to its former self, namely erasure, which is to argue that erasure, rather than being inevitably destined to follow drawing, precedes and is anterior to drawing. It is drawing's pure potentiality. It is not that erasure exists on top of drawing as superficial trace, which is clearly an impossibility, but that drawing happens always under erasure, thereby affirming erasure's prior or originary status, as what Derrida refers to as an architrace. Drawing's origins, like all origins, is nothing more than a beginning again, a repetitive returning of drawing that is predicated upon erasure's reversing or turning back on drawing. One only draws to the extent that erasure has already happened, calling or demanding for drawing's return. John Cage, in that essay on Rauschenberg, writes, "The door is never locked. It's a joy, in fact, to begin over again. In preparation, he erases the de Kooning." And as Derrida has said, an unerasable trace is not a trace, which is to say that unless there is something to erase, drawing cannot be said to exist. This condition might be rephrased by the question, in what way can a drawing still be considered one if it cannot be erased? Drawing presupposes erasure as originary absence, as that which enables drawing to be recognizable as drawing. Drawing is then to be understood as an inscriptive amnesia, the forgetting of and the getting over of erasure. Ironically, then, erasing is the remembering of this absence within drawing. It is what helps drawing remember its own forgetting, not only what drawing forgets, but speaking perhaps ontologically, what drawing is, namely an inscriptive forgetting. Drawing is one of those technologies, in this case perhaps older than almost all others, through which forgetting is forgotten. Signatures. In a word, no draftsmanship. And even in 1953, he sensed where he was heading, toward a visual art that had no further use for the genius of drawing. He may himself have begun to use the erasure, not in de Kooning's manner, constructively, but to see drawing expunged. Whereas in a certain sense it seems obviously correct to say, as Steinberg does in the statement just quoted, that by executing the erased de Kooning drawing, Rauschenberg effectively announced the deprivileging of draftsmanship within the art historical and aesthetic criteria of judgment. Ironically, it might also be said that Rauschenberg reveals the most fundamental aspects, one might go so far as to say the ontology of drawing. It may not be that following Rauschenberg's erasing, drawing must be proclaimed dead, clearly an impossibility, even beyond the obvious history that it has subsequently enjoyed, but that the force of erasure in drawing's potentiality will be all the more difficult to deny. Which is to say that once erasure happens in the way that it happened back in 1953, it is difficult to erase it. This is affirmed by the title of the work, in which the retention of the word drawing bears the persistent and inextricably folded relation between drawing and erasing. Right, it's referred to as the erased de Kooning drawing. Yet this sense of the ontology of drawing also seems to be affirmed by Steinberg himself when he calls our attention to the historiographic imminence of this very drawing within de Kooning's life work. For it can be argued that this is de Kooning's most famous drawing, an assertion to which one might add that the same can be said for Rauschenberg, that it's his most famous drawing. Yet perhaps more perplexing than this mutual sharing in a similarly strange basis of recognition is the way in which it can be said that the erased de Kooning drawing is both de Kooning's and Rauschenberg's most famous drawing. It is here that the question of calculation necessarily arises, as one asks how it is that two artists, without working together on the same project or work, can receive fame from a single work? How might one account for this doubling of signatures, once drawn and once erased? In terms of collaboration, but of what sort? Claims have been made for two signatory presences, all the while based upon signatory traces that are in fact negligible to the point of being illegible. So, two signatures and no signatures at once. If we think of the sheet of drawing paper as the material space in which these two artists are drawn together by erasure, then we can begin to understand how it is that, with the erased de Kooning drawing and the adding up of signatory traces, which is to say, accounting for this doubling of signatures and thereby addressing what appears to be some sort of legal bind, it is necessary that we name no one man. For this drawing erasing absolutely disrupts the logic of the first person present indicative from which the validity and legitimacy of the signature is derived. Is this then a two-handed affair? Or is it four? Who's counting and how? In an early essay on what she referred to as Rauschenberg's materialized images, Rosalind Krauss observed that the surfaces of the artist's early works existed as places where a certain equalization of things and a sense of sameness were achieved. In his essay, The Death of the Author, Roland Barthes famously argued that, quote, a text's unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination. Yet, this destination cannot any longer be personal. The reader is without history, biography, psychology. He is simply that someone who holds together in a single field all the traces by which the written text is constituted. End of quote. I would like to argue that the single sheet of paper that is the material basis of Rauschenberg's erased de Kooning drawing is just such a textual, discursive site, where a relation between artists takes the form of a non-identitarian and impersonal sameness that is affected by a directionality that brings them, and drawing and erasing, together. In this way, I wish to treat this as a question of spacing, in which it is no longer possible to name one man, even though we don't know at this point exactly how many more men there are to be counted, because we still don't know which men count and which do not. Nonetheless, we might proceed by giving ourselves over to a palindromic reading and writing practice, that is, one that involves palindromes, in which sameness is generated regardless of whether the reading or the writing follows a forward or backward direction, right? That's how palindromes work. If you read them left to right and then right to left in a certain sequence of letters and words, they generate the same text. And one of the more well-known palindromes that's often used as an example of such is name no one man. Right? So if you read the phrase name no one man forward, back, you get the same phrase. For no matter whether it is a question of reading the erased de Kooning drawing as drawing or erasing, one reads the same demand, name no one man, a demand that is, in this case, the demand for a unidirectional doubling. It is neither a matter of a directional back-to-back, which would imply succession, opposite ends, divergence, nor front-to-front, as in face-to-face, implying fusion, union, closure, perhaps confusion, but of front to back, and at the same time, back to front, as in approaching or being approached from behind, of taking the door alluded to by Cage in his discussion of this erased drawing as a back door, of doing it from behind or in reverse, as in coitus a tergo, or sex from behind, back to front, front to back. It is through such a directionality, such a sexual spatial positioning, that occurs a non-relational relation, that is, so it seems, also a non-relational betrayal. Think the other meaning of collaborator as traitor. Through a sameness that is not identity and that makes it difficult to name one man in the space of drawing erasing and to be confident that there are simply two. This is also the position assumed by the German soldier Erich and the young French collaborator Ricco on a Parisian rooftop during the liberation of Paris in one of the final scenes of Jean Genet's 1953 novel, Funeral Rites. Funeral Rites is Genet's elegy to his lover Jean de Carnan. And of course, the doubling of first names here between author and lost lover should not be overlooked. Jean, who, as a communist member of the French resistance, was picked off the barricades by a French collaborator whom Genet names Ricco. More specifically and subversively, it is elegetic by way of what Genet forces us to consider to be a positive form of betrayal. Right, certainly one of the hallmarks of Genet's ethics and philosophy is to think betrayal positively. For Genet imagines avenging the death of his lover and affirming the suffering he experiences over his loss by falling in love with the collaborator and the enemy, with an intensity equal to that he felt for Jean. So here's this quote from the last few pages of Funeral Rites. And in it, you'll see that Genet is drawing our attention to the spatial relation between these two men on the rooftop and wants to distinguish it from other ways in which they might come together, right? And so it's this front to back to front that he's interested in, as opposed to face or back to back. Leaning back against the brick monument, facing a Paris that was watching and waiting, Erich buggered Ricco. Their trousers were lowered over their heels, where the belt buckles clinked at each movement. The group was strengthened by leaning against the wall, by being backed up, protected by it. If the two standing males had looked at each other, the quality of the pleasure would not have been the same. Mouth to mouth, chest to chest, with their knees tangled, they would have been entwined in a rapture that would have confined them in a kind of oval that excluded all light. But the bodies in the figurehead, which they formed, looked into the darkness as one looks into the future, the weak sheltered by the stronger, the four eyes staring in front of them. They were projecting the frightful ray of their love to infinity. And then a little bit further on, Erich and Ricco were not loving one in the other. They were escaping from themselves over the world, in full view of the world, in a gesture of victory. Rauschenberg and de Kooning also share in the same direction, or perhaps it should be said that they share a non-relational space in which drawing and erasing are no longer diametrically opposed, but rather expose them together and in the same place to an inexact sameness. This spatial relationality and directionality is neither intersubjective fusion or some Oedipal conflict, but the pleasure and joy of facing in the same direction that leads to an expenditure of all signatory traces, i.e. identities, and is the dissolution of distinctions between self and other, absence and presence, creation and destruction. Together, they face in the same direction onto a future without individual artistic egos and the sociality that is the relation of ego to ego that typically goes by the name of community. The erased de Kooning drawing is a ghosting of signatory traces, themselves already understood to be the ghostly traces of former presences. Here there is a mutual haunting of Rauschenberg and de Kooning and of erasing and drawing. Ghosts are literally the ones who return, and in this case, both artists can be said to have a ghostly presence. De Kooning, in a persistence of inscribed traces that can never be completely erased. Rauschenberg, in a turning drawing back, a returning to drawing through erasure that returns drawing to its originary condition. Both artists are present and absent, mutually and in reverse. De Kooning is absent as the one who draws, and Rauschenberg is present as the one who erases. Absent in drawing and present in erasing, but in such a way that absence and presence seem no longer adequate as descriptors, perhaps suggesting that they never have been and never will be. This might be taken as a perverse inversion of the logic of absence and presence, yet no more so than in any instance of writing and rewriting. Community. This is the last section. This is the writing without addressor and addressee, written simply to whom it may concern, a non-communicative performative act. That is then not writing proper, nor is it exactly erasing, but a different way of meaning, a testifying to an ineluctable disappearance, something like Cage's silence, a becoming imperceptible in a zone of indiscernibility that is nothing more nor less than this sheet of paper. Indeed, not only must one name no one man, but one will be forever uncertain as to which men might be named. Difficult it is, as it is, to assign proper names to such writing, drawing, reading, erasing practices. The inability to say who, the inability to testify, it is this incommunicability of identity that is the language of those without community, those who refuse to be counted, traitorous collaborators, a writing that calls for a different method of calculation, one that can register the incessant and imperceptible coming of two or more men, that is neither a coming together nor apart, but simply prior, a mode of sociality that is a non-relational sharing in sameness without being reduced to a unitary oneness or collective totality. This then would be the unbecoming community, a sharing in the promise of a future to come in all of its uncertainty, and a future that is the promise of uncertainty shared. The alternative may be that of the refugee, a status that each of us will otherwise increasingly need to recognize as our own. Thank you. Questions?
Could you reread the last section?
The last paragraph?
No, the last section.
The community section? This is the writing without addressor and addressee, written simply to whom it may concern, a non-communicative performative act, for example, without significance and subjectification. That is then not writing proper, nor is it exactly erasing, but a different way of meaning, a testifying to an ineluctable disappearance, something like Cage's silence, a becoming imperceptible in a zone of indiscernibility that is nothing more nor less than the sheet of paper. Not only must one name no one man, but one will be forever uncertain as to which men might be named, difficult as it is to assign proper names to such writing, drawing, reading, erasing practices. The inability to say who, the impossibility to testify. It is this incommunicability of identity that is the language of those without community, those who refuse to be counted, traitorous collaborators. A writing that calls for a different method of calculation, one that can register the incessant and imperceptible coming of two or more men, that is neither a coming together nor apart, but simply prior. A mode of sociality that is a non-relational sharing, in sameness, without being reduced to a unitary oneness or collective totality. This then would be the unbecoming community, a sharing in the promise of a future to come in all of its uncertainty, and a future that is the promise of uncertainty shared. And I end by saying, the alternative may be that of the refugee, a status that each of us will otherwise increasingly need to recognize as our own. So I guess in the most simple of terms, the argument is that what Rauschenberg allows us to think is either a form of sociality that lies outside of our conventional notions of community, or that in fact, which is I think where I'm falling on, where my thinking lies with this, is that the kind of spatiality and sociality that he's opening up is precisely the social space of community in its anonymous, uncertain, open and exposed condition.
Is this a new community?
Sorry?
Is this a new community?
I guess the sense is that it's new to the extent that it's new to the extent that the community that's being thought of here is a community that is only in its invention, right? So it might be that it's always new, never old, because there is no old. It's a kind of ongoing. It's that incessant coming, right? That just sort of keeps coming, and so it's always opening up onto. And in that sense, it would be new. That's the sort of notion of the path breaking that I'm getting out of Freud and Derrida's reading of Freud. So how would you basically keep that open? So it is in a way a question of invention, you know. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
But not in the sense that it's a new development socially or politically, right?
Right. What it's not.
Acknowledgement of something that's always existed, perhaps has remained unnamed, unrecognized.
Exactly, because what's happened is instead, in the name of things like politics and a certain sense of community, this condition has been rushed over, has been sort of skipped over, because it's always been regarded as not enough of a platform, one might say, upon which to build a politics or something of that sort. So certainly not invention or new in the sense of this is the new program that's going to replace the old one, and we're just going to be back in that old cycle again. You know, it's really actually working against that logic.
But it does sort of mark this space. seems like a set of instructions for a way of reading and a way of marking the space that's always existed, but it always.
That's
turns
right,
to.
that's
But
right.
now, hey, we can name it this, we can claim it this, we can
Yeah.
use that, not necessarily for anything, but.
Yeah, because at the same time, you want to argue that it's absolutely material. This is not some ephemeral, imaginary, space or zone or something. That it is as material as writing itself, one might say, or art's work, in Haver's terms. That it's very real and material. But doesn't answer to the same kinds of protocols as to what is considered evidence or what is considered substantial or significant or,
What is the fallout or the trajectory of a widespread acceptance of the kind of space you described versus in that trajectory? In terms, you're talking about platforms. But is it potentially used space described as a platform?
can it be turned into a platform?
Well, you were discussing political platforms. I'm saying if there's a widespread acceptance of the space you described, where to from there?
I think it's less a question of acceptance, right, of receiving something wholesale and either rejecting it or accepting it, than it is. I think the space that's being talked about here is a space of exposure rather than acceptance. So it's much more risky and uncertain, and in that sense, where does it lead to? It leads to nothing more than, I think, the promise of a future that would be something other than the kinds of territorial and social partitionings and demarcations and territorializings that has basically constituted the writing of history, of human history, and the kind of violence and aggressivity and so forth that ensues from there. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't answer to the question of politics in the same way that one might want it to, or in the way that one might want it to. Because what it's doing instead is sort of persistently putting the very question of the political into question, as a question, leaving that open. So this is not about resolution, this is not about redemption, this is not about utopia, this isn't about achieving some sort of ultimate end, because there is no ultimate end. It's that sort of desire for ends that I think has gotten us into so much trouble. So instead, if it remains open-ended, then it's what? I don't know. I guess it's sort of always a work in progress or something. This
is subverting the concept of ends altogether.
Yes. Yes. As Giorgio Agamben titles a collection of his essays, the Italian political philosopher, it's means without ends. It's all means. It's all means. There are no ends. And some of us think that those engaged in art or art's work have a particularly unique valence on this and a way of sort of creating the conditions for this kind of pure passage. It's about transmission, but not between A and B, but just onto whatever.
Can you talk about your conception of conventional community?
Well, it's the one that I hint at by referring to things like a collective totality, right?
Yeah.
I mean, basically, the way community is conventionally thought is that you can, in a very confident way and in a very determined way, mark out the boundaries of who's in and who's out, right? It works on an exclusionary logic, and there's some sense of coherence and unity, and right. I mean, it's that basic sort of notion of the social political space as unified.
Whereas what you're talking about is a much more nebulous sense of connections between language and the origins of language and how we interpret it. And that's
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if nebulous is the right word.
Uh-huh.
I'm going
Yeah,
to
Julie.
bring this back to this drawing for a minute. I mean, I appreciate the way that you thought about collaboration and that this was both of their most famous, most well-known actions. But I can't get over the fact that it was also a specific drawing, and I don't know if, is it established that it was in fact an image of a woman that was the subject that was erased?
No, not that I know of.
Yeah, I've never heard, I mean, you presented a drawing that was contemporary in terms of date. I was just curious if you intended that subject was also, the subject that the Kooning agreed could be erased, and Rauschenberg actually proposing to erase the image or the de Kooning. You know, it's been titled now, Erased de Kooning, but I wondered about your proposition of the image. Of
Right,
the
and the proposition is probably only that. You know, there's a real question of whether that even needs to be proposed. I mean, why? Why? You know, in a way, I find myself then arguing against myself, or it doesn't really sort of suit the logic of my argument. You know.
Yeah, I was not sure.
That's sort of I mean, that's the one little sort of art historical pretense or something, you know, just the kind of, oh well, you know, it's 53 and this is what de Kooning is largely working on, and so it might very well be, but and so it's a placeholder. But then the question is, why do I even feel inclined to hold the place in that way, you know? When, in fact, what I really want to do, I mean, the spirit of the project is to remain within the terms of the erased de Kooning drawing, which would then lead me to say something like the very inability to identify any prior subject by gender or sexuality or what have you is precisely part of the force, the critical force of the work, is that it sort of brings us to something that we think of as a prior state, and it's one that doesn't return us to identity, but to something that seems to precede identity. So maybe that's what I need to say. Maybe I need to work that part in where I maybe even still succumb to the pretense of, well, here's de Kooning at this time, and yet take it away and say that's not the move we really want to make.
Maybe the image is there and then that's gone, because I spent a lot of time imagining that image being erased. And recognized, the longer the slide was there, that I had never asked myself that question, well, what was the image that was erased? Well, the image that was erased was attempted to be de Kooning, not figure.
Right. Right.
Well, if it is the woman, you would wind up with a clear statement or marking in a very particular way, so maybe the image should go away.
And I don't want to propose that either.
Right. Neither do I.
It certainly says it's certainly there, and it's certainly visible.
But it see, so Julia's point is really, it's one that encourages us to do what I've said I think I'm doing, which is, you know, someone asked me, so what is it about this paper that's, well, one of the things is that I want to sort of remain with that sheet of paper in all of its sort of non-evidentiary, you know, difficulty and so forth, to really take that seriously. Yeah, the erase de Kooning drawing, and like intensify the term, so to speak, that it gives us, and see what, you know, and so that's why the anti-psychological, whether that's a sexual narrative or an Oedipal thing. I mean, you can imagine the ways in which, up until now, that event has been interpreted. You know, that it's the younger artists and I mean, all of this, which just seems so facile and kind of uninteresting. And I don't think it's dealing with the materiality of the, you know.
The projected slide, it becomes this kind of art historical, or the representation, you know, in the projected slide becomes this art historical fly in the ointment of the theoretical argument, you know. So, I mean, it's.
Which slide?
The drawing.
We're looking at a sort of, you know, modernist depiction of a woman. You know, and I mean, it interests me that this comes up as a question, as a point of interest, and point of concern.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. And then there's Rauschenberg's desire and evident need to save the work, legitimate it, render it archivable, right? So you get the matting and the framing, and it's a gold leaf frame, and then the mat includes the title and so forth, which I haven't dealt with here, but I will. And you know, that just seems to, I mean, you can only imagine what I think of that. I mean, I just think, why, you know? But then, if not, then what? Then we're really returning to the notion of the absolutely disappeared and the absolutely lost, and the which is not uninteresting, you know. I mean, and so the question then becomes, how do you engage in a practice that at once brings you to that point where you're forced to deal with these sorts of things, like the disappeared and the refugee and you know, the radically lost, and not succumb to absolute negation and a nihilism of some sort or something like that, you know. So that's, and you know, that's the kind of project that I'm engaged in the book as well, is looking at a number of different artists and practices that are bringing us to the limits of perception and knowledge and so forth, without giving oneself over to absolute negation. How do you sort of maintain that level, which I'm saying is the only way to in any real way alert us to some of the forces and conditions that we're working under, you know, that are so often covered up in the name of all kinds of other things. So, thank you so much. I understand that this is not an easy paper to listen to. There's a moment in there when I'm sure you thought, I'm only hearing two words over and over again.